Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm really delighted to be here and see so many familiar faces. Thanks to Lear to bring once again the antitrust community together. I'm delighted to introduce my fellow speakers. We have Ilaria Musco, General Counsel of Doctolib in Italy, Nicole Calo, Head of Antitrust Global of ABB, and my colleague Alessandro Di Gio, Counsel at Freshfields here in Rome. We have quite a lot of ground to cover. We're going to tackle distribution in the digital world, new challenges to the horizontal and vertical divide. And we have, as I mentioned, quite a bit of ground to cover because horizontal and vertical has been proved to be a useful shortcut in several cases. But we've seen that for the digital markets, it might give us a bit of a headache, especially if we consider that potential competition kind of automatically might follow in the horizontal bucket, so to speak. So we'll hear more about that from our speakers. And while preparing this panel, we were having a chat about the previous version of the vertical guidance of the European Commission, and it looks like a document of a different era where the concern was clearly promote the nascent internet and digital economy, and while the new issue, the new regulation clearly looks at digital markets in a different way. So it's a very fine line to be threaded. And again, we will hear more from our speakers. And while chatting with in-house lawyers, and I'm so pleased that we have two in-house lawyers because they have to deal with the business. So I'm really curious to hear their insights. But one of the main comments that I got from in-house lawyers is that, okay, the new guidance has several examples, but I'm active in the service industries or even more traditional players, and we will hear from Nicole. Typically I'm a manufacturer, but where I have quite a bit of headaches is in the service part of my business, in the digital part of my business, and even if they see the effort made by the new guidance from the Commission, those examples are still not terribly helpful for us. So without much further ado, I'll leave the floor to Alessandro just to set the scene and remind ourselves of the legal framework we are discussing about, and then I'll hand over to Nicole and Ilaria to give us some perspective from the in-house lawyers who need to deal with the business on a day-to-day basis. Alessandro?
Okay, thank you. And should certainly join you, Ermelinda, in thanking Lear for the organization of this, as usual, great conference. And I should also thank my firm, Freshfields, for the support for being here today, including our head of competition, Gianluca Zampa. So as Ermelinda said, I'll try to set the scene for the topic which we are aiming to discuss today. In the next 10-12 minutes before leaving the floor to our great guests, Nicole and Ilaria, I'll try to cover three topics. I'll briefly recall the rather obvious meaning, but also the origins and the great implications of the distinction between horizontal and vertical agreements. We'll quickly check what response has come from the new vertical guidelines and the new vertical block exemption regulation to the challenge of which this distinction is facing in the new digital world. And I'll complete with raising some questions rather than providing any meaningful answer as to whether this dichotomy is still fit for the digital age. So the question is truly, is this distinction still an effective tool for qualifying and assessing anti-competitive agreement, and does it still serve its purpose of a judicial and enforcement classification tool? So we do have prepared presentations, which I hope you can see now. Yes. So I should start from the basic notions that is clearly known to everybody here, the distinction between horizontal and vertical agreements. I'm borrowing here the definition from the new guidelines on vertical restraints. Clearly, vertical agreements are those between undertakings operating at different levels of the production or distribution chain, whereas horizontal agreements between competing undertakings are those between competing undertakings supplying substitutable goods or services. Do not need here to clarify that, as you all know, there is a bit of distinction between what you will generally define as a vertical agreement under Article 101 and the stricter and more precise definition of vertical agreement for the purpose of the vertical block exemption regulation. Why don't we look quickly at the origins of this distinction, which is fairly recent, or at least not as old, one may think, considering that it is really a cornerstone of the antitrust conceptual architecture. So it seems that antitrust could actually, if not thrive, but at least develop for decades without this distinction, which was conceptualized to a fair extent, probably only starting from the 60s, thanks to the jurisprudence of the US Supreme Court. A great development was then brought forward by the Chicago School, which grounded this distinction on economic grounds. It made it a tool for judicial efficiency, and that is basically when the vertical qualification truly became already a safe harbor from the per se legality rule in the US. And that development can somewhat be effectively summarized by using Borg's word that horizontal is bad, vertical is good. Clearly not to that extreme, but the same approach has been eventually followed also at European level, and the distinction has become important and key also in the European Commission policy documents, as well as in the European Court of Justice case law. As we mentioned already, the vertical versus horizontal distinction is a key notion in the concrete life of enforcement and self-assessment of agreements. Everybody which practicing antitrust law would know that when facing an agreement, that's almost the first question you would answer, or you would pose yourself. And therefore, I mean, it is a classification which has very significant practical implications, clearly in terms of application or not of the vertical block exemption regulation and the safe harbor it provides undertakings with. But even in the context of the individual assessment of agreements, qualifying overall an agreement as vertical rather than horizontal will have very significant implications in terms, for instance, of higher likelihood that if the agreement will be seen as a restriction by object rather than a restriction by effect, if the agreement is overall deemed to be of horizontal nature. And also, from a practical perspective, the presumptions or at least evidentiary burdens will operate in practice in a different way by authorities and by courts if you are facing a vertical rather than an horizontal agreement. And there are, of course, also implications in terms of access to leniency or commitments. We know that is not really the drawing line there. The notion of cartel is rather the key concept there, but still, sometimes the boundaries are unclear, and the definition of vertical versus horizontal may affect the availability or the suitability of those procedural routes from a practical perspective. And interestingly, from a global perspective and a multi-jury perspective, the qualification of an agreement as vertical versus horizontal may have also implications in terms of potential filings, because some of you may have already experienced that an increasing number of jurisdictions are actually making alliances, contractual alliances, cooperation agreements subject to mandatory merger or quasi-merger filing obligations. And that is the case for Brazil, Mexico, and a bunch of other jurisdictions across the globe. And usually those merger filing obligations only apply in the context of horizontal cooperation. So once again, the horizontal versus vertical classification has a practical meaning also from that perspective. Clearly, this is a tradition, a distinction which has attracted criticism even in the past decades. So even in a non-digital world, there was clearly a reaction against the Chicago perspective, in the sense that there was the risk was identified that by looking at vertical agreements as such good or potentially good, that there may be an general underestimation of their impact. The notion of vertical competition is quite good in illustrating that response already, and it seems to be a notion which is gaining again now importance and relevance, for instance, in the context of digital ecosystems, as it was recalled just in the plenary session half an hour ago. And clearly, as you can see here from some interesting quotes, there have been over decades, the weakness of this distinction had already been highlighted. But that distinction, this dichotomy, is now facing new challenges, which makes it even more doubtful that it may serve well its original purpose. And clearly, online data and platform economies are all contributing to blur the lines between horizontal and vertical agreements. We've just here listed some developments and some trends in that direction. Clearly, the dual distribution topic is a key one in this respect, and Nicole is gonna talk to us about it. And clearly, that issue is exacerbated by the fact that online technologies are clearly supporting disintermediation of traditional distribution models. There is an increasing number of instances where horizontal and collusion theory of arms are attached to vertical agreements, and most favored nation clauses are probably the best example in that respect. So it's look at clauses and agreements between players at different levels of the chain, and in that context, so for across customers rate parity clauses, as they were identified in one pioneer study, which Lear itself submitted many years ago to Lear, to the OFT. The main theory of arms are actually of horizontal nature rather than foreclosure vertical ones. So that is really a good example of a mixture already of vertical agreements, which is triggering horizontal concern rather than vertical foreclosure ones. Then, of course, the disruptive business model of online marketplaces, which, as it has already been indicated, do blur the lines between what is vertical, what is horizontal. That's even clearer in the context of hybrid platforms, where there is a supply relationship on top of the intermediation services provision. There is a growing number of cases where the parties do overlap at multiple levels of the value chain. And that is also related to the fact that in the digital world, there are newer alternative ways of looking at how to define markets. And if one were to bring to the extreme certain tendencies to, for instance, even look at the market for online users' attention, you may end up in seeing almost all undertakings as competitors in the context of many relationships, or even in the context of personal data. Many vertical agreements will do already and will increasingly include the provisions about the supply of data, personal data, between the parties of the vertical agreements. That will probably make them competitors in that respect, because both those parties will, in different ways, also be suppliers of those data to purchaser of personal data, to advertising companies or to other companies in those markets. So many instances, many trends in the direction of blurring the lines between what is vertical, what is horizontal. What responses can we find already from the recent EU legislation and guidance? Clearly, you can see in the guidelines on vertical restraint that there is awareness of these challenges, and the fact that it is not easy to categorize using the concept applied to vertical agreements which come ultimately from the brick and mortar environment. So a first observation to be made in that context is probably that vertical agreements are still subject to a separate legal framework, separate from horizontal ones. I mean, that in the sense that the Commission has decided to still go for, vertical guidelines, horizontal cooperation guidelines. That may seem, and probably was, an obvious and an inevitable choice. But all these difficulties and trends which we refer to may suggest that perhaps in the future and in the longer term, even from a legislation production standpoint, we may think of different ways of creating guidance and soft legislation for addressing these topics. So perhaps the legislation may be built around different concepts, maybe intra-brand versus inter-brand, substitution versus complementarity. So it may be that in the future we go for other directions. We're not there yet, but it's at least worth imagining that may happen in the future. What else? The vertical guidelines and the vertical block exemption regulation do establish bridges to the horizontal guidelines, which are still under preparation. And that is because in many instances, the vertical guidelines do exclude the vertical agreements from their scope, or make it clear that there are horizontal concerns which are not dealt with in the vertical guidelines. But other than making references, there's not really much guidance. And if you then go and look at the horizontal guidelines, you may not find what you may be looking for. So, I mean, there are topics which seem to end up a bit in no man's land, because you look at the vertical guidelines and you read about the horizontal effects or aspects of parity clauses. Then you go to the horizontal guidelines and there is basically nothing about it. Or about marketplaces limitations, marketplaces restraints, a big effort has been done on the vertical restraints and the vertical guidelines about them. But those guidelines also identify the fact that there are horizontal concerns attached to them, and that the horizontal guidelines will be better placed to provide guidance in that respect. But then you go to the horizontal guidance, not much about it actually. So it seems that these two universes need to speak more than they do now. And clearly, given that the horizontal guidelines are still under preparation, probably that signals a room for doing perhaps a bit more in that respect in the coming months, if it's still possible. I understand the timing for the adoption of those guidelines has actually been extended to the first half of 2023, so there may still be time. Conscious of timing limitation, let's quickly move to the next slide. And here we look at more specific topics which really are at the core of the issue which we are discussing today. So the difficulty of qualifying an agreement as vertical or horizontal. That was indeed, I mean, it is indeed an easy task, and the vertical block exemption regulation in this regard, has sometimes shown to prefer a more rigid approach in excluding from the outset a certain conduct from its scope, whereas in other cases it has seemed to be a bit more flexible in using open concepts. An example of a still fairly radical, or at least in the sense rigid approach, may be that in the context of the exclusion of the vertical block exemption regulation in the case of distribution agreements between undertakings which are competitors at upstream level for the goods or services which are the object of the distribution agreement. And that is done regardless of the relevance or weight of those goods in terms of market shares or in terms of even the relevance of those goods for the parties to the agreement. So that signals a clear-cut decision done by the vertical block exemption regulation, which is understandable, but in a way is rather different and contrast in a way with the approach instead taken, for instance, in the context of the dual distribution, where instead the Commission dropped the reference to market shares, which are originally included, and use open concept, so the necessity to improve the production or distribution of the contract goods, which is not like a clear-cut concept which arguably one may expect in terms of legal certainty in the context of a block exemption regulation. Other examples, but perhaps time limitations suggest me to go for the conclusions, and as I anticipated, there are no answers whatsoever in my conclusions, just questions. So the main question is this dichotomy, is this distinction still fit for the digital age? Is it still helpful? Does it remain the prime antitrust qualification tool for agreements as it has been for the past decades? Difficult to say, but an observation which may be made is that somewhat in the opposite way of what happened. So I referred at the beginning at the Chicago approach to vertical agreements, and the reaction there was, wait a minute, I mean, you may be overlooking horizontal concerns, so you may be overestimating the notion of vertical agreements. So the question here is rather the opposite one. Are we facing the risk that instead we may be looking at agreements as horizontal too often or too widely, and that may become a way in or a shortcut to the objective box? So the qualification of an agreement as an horizontal one may serve or may result in basically avoid an effects or a full effects-based analysis of agreements. So that perhaps a risk which we felt like flagging. And I mean, clearly the response to that, but it's not an original one, is that as it has been already in the past, but increasingly so nowadays, it would be helpful if the focus shifts away from classification and using boxes and move instead toward a somewhat holistic effect-based analysis where not too many consequences from a legal standpoint are attached to a general vertical versus horizontal classification. And with this, I pass the floor to you, Ermelinda, again.
Thank you, Alessandro. I think we will want to see if Nicole has some answers to your questions. Over to you, Nicole. Thank you.
Grazie, Ermelinda. The answer is no. I sadly don't have the answers. But so I've prepared some slides. Hopefully, you will see them in a second. So I'm here to basically just maybe present one perspective in this entire debate, which is extremely interesting. We can make it as theoretical as we want, and we can debate for ages. However, I just wanted to throw in my little needle in there and try to give to the audience here a day-to-day reality and perspective from a global business. And hopefully I will address some of your points, but from a different angle. So dual distribution, so everybody knows what that is. You have, your distributor, you have your manufacturer. The manufacturer is also active in the distribution, so the downstream market. Now, query what active is, but for example, for a group like ABB, for some of our businesses, we heavily rely, dare I say, we are really dependent on our distributors to sell our products, right? But ABB as well does sell the products on occasions directly. Okay, so that makes us a dual distribution player for some of our businesses, right? And I've been talking to the head of global distribution just last week to get his thoughts about the topic. And I was telling him, that, in the new law coming from the EU, we are potentially considered to be competing with our distributors, right? And this has implications on what we can or cannot do. He looked at me, he was like, what? We're not competing with them, we need them. They are necessary to our business. I mean, how can we be competing with them? We create them, and then we would be expected to go and start competing against them. It doesn't make any sense what you're telling me. Those were his words, más o menos, no? And so I tell him, yeah, fair point. And we need those distributors. We invest a lot in them. We're not going to start competing with them. So that's the starting point. Appreciating life is not black and white, and there are some competition on the fringes on occasions. But the starting point for companies like us is we do not compete with our distributors. So the inclusion of the new exception in the block exemption regulation about the exchange of information between a manufacturer and a distributor. So the Commission really saying, you're still block exempted. The vertical relationship is still, as a whole, beneficial to the economy. However, watch out, because you should be very careful what you exchange in terms of information. And this going beyond the RPM, the traditional RPM concept, okay? And so from a practical perspective, the compliance departments, we're left with the question, do we need to revisit our template distribution agreements now? Do we need to make sure that our business guys are not asking what they shouldn't be asking from their distributors? That caused huge chaos, because obviously we rely on market intelligence that we get from these guys. We need it to develop better products, to have a better reach to the market, right? And so this is, a practical reality that we're facing. Antitrust agencies, no matter what is being said at the moment, they have recognized in the past, when you deal with them, also in the case law, they do not see distributors as competing with manufacturers most of the time. And that goes also with wholesalers, okay? And I should just say that, at least at ABB, distributors, we define as those resellers that just buy your product, resell the product as is. No value add other than obviously their know-how of the territory, after-sales services, that kind of thing. They are not system integrators or other type of resellers. I think I should make the point because it's extremely important. Alessandro, if you could move on to, I'm not following the slides, right, because this is just for visual support. I'm just going to give you another concrete example of our challenges. Some of you may have heard of the practice of funneling. I mean, at Freshfields, you know that more than I do, but effectively, it is as follows. A manufacturer like ABB has a global reach, global customers, you know, that are very big. Sometimes these customers do not want to deal with your Lambda distributor in his territory. They want to speak to the manufacturer directly. There's this conception that you get better prices when you speak to the manufacturer. Not always. And we start making a marketing pitch, you know, that's it, they're seduced, they want to buy, in my instance, the ABB products. And then comes the question, so where do I buy those ABB products? We respond, well, we do not have the logisticals and the capacity to sell to you directly because we do not. We have a very good set of distributors you can approach. Okay, but I'm a global player, Nicole, and I do not care to have different prices per country I go to buy your product. I'm procuring my products centrally. I need to have one price, please, because otherwise it's too complex for me. So far, fair enough, right? And so what we can do under the law is to basically impose what we call this maximum price on those selected distributors by the purchaser. We tell them, for this account, guys, very important, please make sure that you do not sell above 100. Okay, because otherwise you lose the account to Siemens or to GE, right? This is about competition at the end of the day. Distributor, the reality of it is that they're like, yeah, no, you know, my margins, my business, you know, and we're like, okay, we'll compensate you, right? We'll grant you an additional rebate, which we call the funneling rebate. But we're not supposed to know anything about the retail price of that distributor, the price he or she is ultimately going to apply to the customer, because that would be RPM terrain, right? We're very conscious of that. So ABB has to take the risk of distributors playing us a little bit and of the uncertainty of not knowing ultimately the retail price that will be applied. The only thing we want to know is that the customer is happy, you know, and hopefully, you know, the maximum price will have been applied. But, you know, we have to go through such lenses to basically tell the distributor, I don't want to know about the price you ultimately do. Because they come to us naturally, they want to discuss, and we're like, no, we don't want to listen to you. Just sell. We have to, you know, come to the practical realities. We have to devise contracts. Can they be tripartite contracts? Can they not? What kind of assurances can we give? And we need to compensate the distributor with a funneling rebate, relying on their own words. You know, yeah, we need an additional 10% discount. And we cannot even verify it. So ultimately, we have to pay the price of this very, should I say, I mean, I appreciate the RPM danger here, but this is really not the idea. We want to sell our products. And the logic of this practice is that prices go down. Because believe you me, we are facing strong customers. You know, they're not tiny customers, so we are under heavy pressure. But, you know, the RPM problematic is an accepted one, I appreciate that, but there's also the exchange that you have to have with your distributors. Well, this customer might like this, might like that, and we have to basically advise our teams that when they speak with distributor, they speak with customer, they cannot talk about pricing whatsoever. So they have to basically, we're telling them, you leave the room if the discussion, you know, starts to veering in prices. And you're like with your most important customer and your distributor, and yet you have to leave the room. It's like, that's quite tough from a business perspective. Let's move on, if you would, Alessandro, grazie. So the new challenges, exchange of information has been singled out by the European Commission as one of the areas where, you know, they will look at us. Fair enough. But what they tell us is that unless your exchange with your distributor, which may I remind you, it's not a competitor, but okay, your exchange has to be directly related to the implementation of the agreement. Okay, yes. And or, and I'm not quite sure if it's an or an and, because depending on the language version and the way it's drafted in the English version in this negative way is a bit perplexing to me, it has to be necessary to improve the production or the distribution of the contract's goods. Well, arguably all of our exchanges are like that. All of our exchanges meet that aim. And on top of that, we do not compete. And so we are, and let me remind you that we're not dealing with just one distributor. We are dealing with 5,000 minimum, right? 10,000, I don't know if you take the global ABB world. We are not going to be able to assess on a case-by-case whether there is a little bit more of a competitive element here just because a customer may decide to threaten the distributor and say, if I don't get good prices, I'm going to go and see ABB directly. And they do that every day. That is competition. That doesn't make us a competitor of our distributors. So arguably, we are dealing with very practical difficulties. We feel we pay a heavy price for a concept, vertical versus horizontal concept, which is probably now needs to be a little bit revisited and made a little bit more practical. I mean, in the US, in a totally different area of the law, we're talking about interlocking directorates, for example, they have this practical element, how much of your revenues overlap with that of the company you are interlocking with. If it's below, I can't remember the number, but as a threshold, then you're okay, you're not really competitors, and it's safer for you to be on that board kind of thing. Let's have some practical guidance here where we can actually start breathing as a company, because the reality of it, the compliance departments of a company like ABB, it's so big, you cannot afford to look at it contract by contract. You have templates. And so the reality of it, we will be overly restrictive because we don't want to fall afoul of antitrust rules, certainly not, and certainly not ABB. So let me just ask you to maybe move the slides. For example, just to give you an idea, because in your own time, I'm sure you know the block exemption or the guidelines more than I do, but you have on the left, my left, the whitelist. So this is information that you could usually exchange, no problem. And then you have on the right, the blacklist. So we're back again on that blacklist, whitelist. Okay. Just to give you one example. Information, we're not supposed to exchange, as a matter of principle, information about the identity of the end users. So my distributor's customers. Really. Unless to satisfy the requirement of particular end users, so if you have a tailor-made product, fair enough, or to grant end-user special conditions. So who is granting what? Am I, ABB, granting directly, or is it to basically devise a rebate scheme for my distributor for him or her to then apply to its own customers? And then obviously after-sales services. So there is some flexibility, but again, if you're not on the white list, in practice, you start to be concerned, right? And we exchanged, thankfully we do, much more than what's on the white list here with our distributors. Just moving a bit fast because I think I don't want to take too much of Ilaria's time. And so this is my last slide. So this is not about, again, the business versus the European Commission. I mean, we need regulators in this world. Yes, we do. We need academics. We need businesses. And, if you think about it, Amazon is the kind of like the monster here, but I'm sure all of you have ordered from Amazon and are pretty happy about the services. So I think it takes all to make a world, and I think I welcome personally the debate. But let's also not forget the business reality. I mean, can I just say that in my practice today, I cover merger control, I cover follow-on damage litigation, I cover day-to-day contracts. Our life is hell. Merger control, Article 22, oh my God. We need certainty as businesses, we really do. At least some certainty, appreciating that the world is changing, appreciating all of this, but we need a little bit of certainty in order to be able to create new products, innovate. We need that also. And so I'm going to leave you with a couple of thoughts, and there are no answers, Ermelinda and Alessandro. But basically, on the dual distribution point, which was my topic of today, I could go on forever about merger control. But, we need a little bit more guidance on, maybe a positive guidance here from the Commission and other agencies across the globe. Some comfort here that a manufacturer will not be taken to be competing with his distributors as a general rule. That takes a bit of this away from us. Of course, there will be exceptions, absolutely, right? But as a general rule, if we know that we are really in a vertical relationship here, don't worry, as a matter of principle. We feel a little bit better, we can start breathing again as a business. I mentioned to you the template contracts, the templates that we need to devise, and it would be a bit easier for us. yeah, we need those distributors. And does that make us, is that something that we could, throw into the equation of what is a potential competitor? Commission has recently reduced the years from 3 to 1 in terms of potential entry, or I think one of the criteria is, absent the vertical agreement, would you be competing? The answer is no. Absent the vertical agreement with our distributors, we would not exist, full stop, right? I've talked about the impact on the internal compliance. I just wanted to maybe nicely transition to Ilaria via Ermelinda, that of course the digital world is creating issues. Just to give you one example, ABB is not in the business of Amazon, right? Seems to me that a lot of these new challenges and this new law has been created by the GAFAMs, as we call them. We have an online platform, right? But we sell our own products. And sometimes we want to invite our own distributors, to give them visibility. And this is not, competing, because sometimes they will be based in Italy and they will have the warehouse just 20 minutes from the customer. They're a better place to serve the customer, right? Does that make us competitors online because our name is there, their names are there, customer can click on both? I certainly do not think so, but obviously welcome any idea. And on this, I will stop. Apologies if I overrun. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Nicole. And definitely we can see you have been grilled by your business partner quite on a regular basis. I'll just give a few seconds to Ilaria to settle in, just to conclude with 5-7 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Ermelinda. Thanks, Alessandro, for your absolutely interesting and exhaustive presentation. And thank you also, Nicole. And Nicole, you left me the hot potato. I mean, after your so brilliant and passionate presentation, there is no way for me to keep alive the attention of these guys. No, okay. Okay, so I'm a lawyer. I'm not an expert lawyer on antitrust. My contribution today, just to give my personal experience, I had the pleasure to work for 2 digital innovative startup company, digital platform company in Italy. And I will tell you, and they tried to figure out what these new business have in common. How do they face antitrust issue in the sense which Alessandro just explained, hybrid model for digital platform, new businesses. And with all the reasoning already I presented by Nicole, the reality is that we have to do business and we have to rely on our partner and we have to create long-term relationship with that partner. The easy task for a digital company, a startup digital company, digital platform is that at the beginning you are so small, but you hope to get the market in 2-3 years. So what is easy to do at the beginning, an easy partnership, won't be so easy in the course of the execution of the partnership as well, because then you become bigger, you will attract the attention of competitor, you will attract the attention of antitrust authority, and probably you have to change again your agreement, which means to change again all your plan. So it's an impact on the business. But let's go just a little bit step by step. I just included a very basic definition of whatever is an online platform, just to give you an idea about the potential implication in terms of business on online platform. And the fact how much the market is growing, the potentiality of the online platform. I just included some numbers. These numbers were related mainly to a European study on the condition on workers. So the reference was to Deliveroo, Just Eat, all the platforms that you know. But in any case, these numbers give you an idea about the market, how relevant it is, and all the implications that we may have in this market. What is the tricky part? The tricky part is that when we think of online platform, we think of this one: Facebook, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Alibaba. Just to give you an example. I'm sorry, the slide is in Italian, but this is the numbers refers to the value in billion of this company according to Forbes and a study published in 2021. But likely, these giants are not the total of the market. There are other minor companies, other online platforms, which are expanding, which create, in any case, antitrust issue, as I told at the beginning, not maybe in the immediate, but maybe in 2, 3, 4 years, we will have more issue. And I'm going to be more concrete now. I will just skip this one. On this slide, just to give you, the number which I think is relevant is from Boston Consulting Group, a study published last year. There were 100 tech challengers, new online platform operating into the market. And they counted at least 10 of them being potential new Amazon or Google. So this again gives you an idea how good this market is, how live, how active, how it's growing in terms of time. And then, I'm going just to the concrete example. If you think, for those who are based in Italy, probably when I think of a live streaming platform, do they have in mind what that could be? Transmitting a live sport event. And e-health digital platform, for those who have heard about Uno Bravo or Serenis or Mio Dottore or Doctolib, which is a new market where at least we have a big in Italy 4 players, new players on top of the traditional one. So do you have an idea on what those platforms can have in mind, can have in common? It's just to break the ice and don't okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. Okay. Yeah. The main characteristic is that the online platform, an emerging new platform. So first of all, innovative online platform, plus a scale-up model, because all of these came from a successful model already launched in Europe. For the platform, the live sports streaming platform I'm referring to, they came after successful experience in Canada, in Brazil, in France, not in France, in Germany and in Switzerland, and they decided to launch in Italy. So they have the model to get more and more bigger share of market because they think they have a successful model already scale up in other countries. They are linked to potential essential services. The truth is that when they launch into the market, they don't expect to have an essential good, but in the case of live streaming, then they discovered that football, Serie A, was close to an essential facility, and in case of health, in the last relationship from Draghi, in the last report from Draghi to the ministry, was clearly said that digital health is an essential facility. So the attention to that is growing and growing. In a merger we had to do that, follow the golden rule. According to this principle, e-health is now an essential facility because it's digital, it's held to PNRR, investment coming from PNRR, and in the game there is more attention to this one. Lack of dominant position, because when they launch in Italy, they are so small. No one cares about that the first month, and then they become. They look for a strong partnership agreement, otherwise they can't survive into the market, and that's linked to what just Nicole said. We need partnership agreement, strong partnership agreement. They are all our partner, we know, they are also competitors, but we need them as a distributor. Exactly what Nicole explained to you. Antitrust issue, what they have in common, antitrust issue. So small, but with, so hybrid area, hybrid model, the one described by Alessandro, and then we have to face antitrust issue in a scenario where everything is not explicitly clear. As Nicole said, our life within a company sometimes could be an hell. In the case of my previous experience, my summer was an hell. And then, what I can, just to give you a spot on my personal experience, where there is ambiguity or where there is the need to protect the business identity, no company wants to be in breach of antitrust law, for sure, that's for sure. I don't know any legal suggesting the company to be in breach of antitrust principle. No one. No one is so ingenious. The point is that how can we survive to secure the business, to protect the business, to give the best advice, but to do the best work within the company to protect the business. And I just mentioned here some example. Again, let's consider partnership agreement, distribution agreement for something which is new. So you don't have a case history, you don't know the future, you can't predict the future. There are some specific business tools combined with legal analysis. One of them is what we call internally anti-cannibalization clause, which means you distribute my product, you can sell my product, but I can sell my product as well. But we should include it into the contract to make sure that the partnership will be in a good shape for 4 or 5 years old. Otherwise, it's not a partnership, it's just a law affair. We need to have something which protects each other. And it means that in case your business is growing too much with respect to my business because the target is the same, we should rebalance the fee and the money I'm going to pay, just to give balance to the agreement. Another point which is relevant, in particular in the digital field and online platform, is the issue around portability. You may have heard the news about the investigation on Google to apply to strict portability limitation to disincentivize the user to churn. This is really important in our field because the only tool we have now is GDPR, where interoperability and portability is granted under GDPR, but not from a competition perspective. It is something that we are looking really, really careful because it's really interesting to us. Other conditions that usually are included in this agreement are pre-agreed mitigation plan. So what happens if we have to terminate the agreement because we grow so far? Because we thought at the beginning to have a partnership for 4 years, 5 years, but the reality is that after 1 year, after 3 years, I got more than 20% of the market share, and we have to negotiate. What about the customer? This is something that the business and legal within the company had to suggest to include into the contract, also to avoid litigation in future and to give sustainability to the market. MFN, parity clauses, which now are so creative, which goes behind just the price, but also in terms of exclusivity on new feature that you launch into the market. So it's really a creative field. Clause to regulate potential consequence of regulatory challenge is something, again, which is really included just to agree in advance what could happen to preserve the deal. And the most creative I just recently seen was because we don't know how the market will go, let's appoint an expert, one of the big 4, PwC or Ernst Young or something like that, to monitor the market share of the parties. So the same advisor be appointed by the party to check the market share of each of the party and to raise the flag if one of the parties raises a relevant share to the market to renegotiate the deal, which again exposes the party to the exchange of a dangerous exchange of information, even if through an appointed third party. And they would end here.
Thank you, Ilaria. I understand that different from what's standard time in Rome, lunch is being served. So I think we can address questions over lunch. Thank you, everybody.